Welcome to Mental Flight, where bold ideas take off and untold truths soar beyond the limits of ordinary thinking. Then fasten your mind, you're cleared for takeoff 5-0 over Dargo, Burkina. Faso's war with the old order is not just a headline, but a reflection of a fierce reality unfolding in the heart of West Africa. In the small yet defiant nation of Burkina Faso, the town of Dargo has become the latest flashpoint in a struggle that pits a rising spirit of sovereignty against entrenched forces determined to keep the old power structures alive. The attack on Dargo is not an isolated act of violence. It is a calculated response from those threatened by Burkina Faso's bold rejection of the old order. This old order is the network of political, economic, and military influences that, for decades, dictated the fate of African nations, often from foreign capitals. Since Captain Ibrahim Traoré's rise to power, Burkina Faso has taken a path that rejects dependency, foreign interference, and the exploitation of its resources. This stance, while celebrated by those yearning for an Africa that stands on its own terms, has drawn the ire of powerful interests both inside and outside the continent. Dargo's burning streets and the sound of distant gunfire are the physical echoes of this geopolitical clash. Local defenders, many of them young and fiercely loyal to the vision of a free Burkina Faso, are confronting well-armed aggressors who seem determined to destabilize the nation from within. These attackers are not merely seeking control of land, but are sending a warning to all who dare to break free from the old chains of influence. The people of Dargo now find themselves in the middle of a battle that is as much about ideology as it is about territory. For them, survival means holding the line against forces that would prefer to see Burkina Faso return to a time when its policies were dictated from afar and its resources flowed outward without benefiting its own citizens. As smoke rises above the town, the conflict sends a message far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. This war in Dargo is a test of how far the old order is willing to go to maintain its grip, and how much sacrifice a young African nation is prepared to endure to claim its destiny. It is a fight that will determine whether Burkina Faso's resistance becomes a blueprint for others or a cautionary tale of the cost of defiance. The outcome is uncertain, but one truth is clear. The flames over Dargo are not just consuming buildings, they are igniting a fire in the hearts of those who believe in a future where Africa stands unshaken and unbroken. Dargo symbolizes Burkina Faso's defiance against foreign dominance in a way that blends the realities of war, weight of history, and the resilience of a nation determined to reclaim its destiny. For decades, Burkina Faso, like many African nations, existed under a global system where its sovereignty was largely symbolic. Decisions about its economy, governance, and resources often stemmed from boardrooms and government offices far beyond its borders. The so-called Old Order thrived on this arrangement, ensuring that African states remained dependent, compliant, and incapable of breaking the cycles of exploitation. In recent years, this balance of power began to shift. Under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a young, muscular, dark-skinned leader with a soldier's discipline and a revolutionary spirit, Burkina Faso took bold steps toward self-determination. Traoré's government rejected foreign military bases that once dotted its landscape and challenged the exploitative contracts that bled its gold, cotton, and other resources away from its people. This stance made him a symbol of a new Africa, one that would rather endure hardship than live on its knees. Dargo emerged as a microcosm of this transformation. Situated in a region vulnerable to insurgent activity, the town has always been strategic for those seeking control, whether for political leverage, smuggling routes, or destabilization campaigns. When attacks erupted there, they were not simply acts of local banditry, carried the hallmarks of larger geopolitical games, the fingerprints of forces with the resources and motivation to punish Burkina Faso for its refusal to obey the old rules. The people of Dargo, however, are not passive victims in this story. They are farmers, traders, elders, and youth who have chosen to align themselves with the vision of a sovereign Burkina Faso. Many have volunteered to assist defense forces, acting as eyes and ears against infiltrators, guarding supply routes and protecting their communities from collapse. They understand that Dargo's survival is not just about keeping their homes intact, but about upholding a statement that their nation will not be bullied back into submission. The symbolism of Dargo's resistance is powerful because it taps into a shared African memory of colonial and neo-colonial exploitation. For generations, foreign dominance meant that the continent's wealth flowed outward while its people remained trapped in poverty. The idea that one small town, far from the world's economic centers, can become a beacon of defiance speaks to a wider hunger for dignity and self-rule. This is why Dargo's plight has captured attention well beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The battle for Dargo is also a psychological one. For the old order, crushing such a stronghold of resistance sends a message to other communities, both within Burkina Faso and across Africa, that defiance carries unbearable costs. If Dargo falls, it could serve as a cautionary tale to other towns or nations tempted to follow in Traore's footsteps. But if Dargo stands, it becomes a living example that sovereignty is worth fighting for, even against the most overwhelming odds. Every street in Dargo now carries the weight of this symbolic fight. The sight of armed defenders patrolling dusty roads, the sound of gunfire echoing through the fields, the smoke rising over the town are not just local tragedies, but scenes in a much larger drama. For the defenders, each skirmish is another chance to prove that Burkina Faso's independence is not a hollow slogan, but a lived reality. The determination seen in Dargo has roots in the country's revolutionary past. Burkina Faso's history includes leaders like Thomas Sankara, who in the 1980s championed policies of self-reliance and anti-imperialism before his assassination, widely believed to be orchestrated with foreign complicity. That legacy lives on in today's struggle, and Dargo has become a physical manifestation of the unfinished work Sankara began. Young men and women in Dargo, many of whom were not even born during Sankara's era, are now carrying forward that torch, fueled by stories of resistance and dreams of a liberated future. Economically, the stakes are equally high. Control over Dargo means influence over local trade and resource movement. For foreign powers or proxy forces aligned with the old order, destabilizing Dargo could weaken Burkina Faso's ability to manage its own supply lines and keep its rural economy functioning. This is why the town has been targeted so intensely, because its fall would not only demoralize the nation, but also disrupt its push toward economic independence. The social fabric of Dargo, though under immense strain, reflects a deep sense of unity born from shared hardship. Families shelter one another during bombardments. Community leaders coordinate defense efforts, and local healers tend to the wounded when formal medical services are overwhelmed. Such unity is rare in times of war, but in Dargo, it is driven by the understanding that their collective survival is tied to the survival of the nation's vision of sovereignty. Internationally, the narrative of Dargo's defiance is being watched closely. While some foreign governments frame the situation in Burkina Faso as purely a security crisis, others recognize it as a political stand against a global system that has long treated Africa as a source of extraction rather than a partner. This global attention is both a blessing and a curse for Dargo. On one hand, it brings awareness to their struggle. On the other, it risks drawing more aggressive attempts to neutralize their resistance before it inspires similar uprisings elsewhere. As the fighting continues, Dargo's name has begun to circulate among African youth movements, Pan-Africanist organizations, and diaspora communities who see in it a symbol of what courage looks like in the modern age. Songs, speeches, and online campaigns are emerging that place Dargo alongside other historic sites of resistance. From anti-colonial battlefields to liberation strongholds, this growing cultural recognition deepens the stakes for those seeking to control or destroy the town. Dargo's significance is not in its size or its wealth, but in the message it sends, that sovereignty is not something granted by the old order but claimed by those willing to defend it at all costs. The attack reflects the old order's attempt to crush rising African sovereignty by striking at a symbolic and strategic target, aiming to send a message that resistance will not be tolerated. For decades, Africa's political and economic trajectory has been shaped by external forces, former colonial powers, multinational corporations, global institutions that operated under the belief that the continent's resources and policies should serve their interests first. This arrangement, often disguised under the language of cooperation, aid, and security, kept African nations tied to systems of dependency where true sovereignty remained out of reach. When leaders and movements within Africa rise to challenge this imbalance, Burkina Faso, under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, has become one of the clearest examples of this shift. Rejecting foreign military presence, canceling exploitative contracts, and asserting control over national resources, Traoré's government has chosen a path that prioritizes national dignity over external approval. Such moves, though popular among citizens and Pan-Africanists, are deeply unsettling to those who benefit from the old order. This is why attacks like the one on Dargo are far more than local conflicts. They are calculated strikes intended to destabilize the government, undermine public confidence, and reverse the momentum toward independence. The old order operates with precision. It does not always act openly. Instead, it works through proxies, covert funding, and alliances with internal actors who see personal gain in aligning with foreign agendas. Insurgent groups, militias, and criminal networks can be influenced or armed to create chaos in regions that have strategic importance. Dargo, positioned in a sensitive zone, offers both symbolic and practical value. By targeting such a place, aggressors aim to force the government to divert resources, appear vulnerable, and eventually compromise on its anti-imperialist policies. The logic is simple, yet ruthless. If you can make a government seem incapable of protecting its people, you can weaken its political standing and open the door for external influence to reassert itself. This tactic has been used repeatedly in Africa's post-independence history. It's nations that have tried to nationalize industries, reject unfair trade agreements, or form alliances outside Western dominance have often faced destabilization campaigns. Coups, assassinations, economic sabotage, and insurgencies have been tools of choice. The attack on Dargo fits this pattern seamlessly, making it part of a much larger, older playbook designed to remind rising African powers that the cost of defiance can be severe. What makes the current situation different is the growing awareness among African populations about these tactics. In the past, narratives about insurgent violence were often framed purely as ethnic disputes, religious extremism, or random instability. Today, with more access to information and stronger Pan-African networks, people are quicker to question who benefits from these conflicts and whose interests are truly being served. In the case of Dargo, the timing, scale, and coordination of the attack strongly suggest that it was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader campaign to roll back Burkina Faso's new political course. The people on the ground understand this, and so does the government, which has repeatedly accused foreign powers of covertly supporting destabilizing forces. Beyond Burkina Faso, the attack sends a signal to other African nations considering similar paths of sovereignty. If a country refuses to cooperate with the old order, it risks not only economic pressure, but also violence within its borders. This threat is intended to discourage bold reforms, keeping nations within the bounds of what is considered acceptable by global power centers. The old order thrives on fear, and high-profile attacks like this are designed to feed that fear. The psychological impact of such violence cannot be underestimated. It is not only about the physical destruction of a town or the loss of lives, it is about planting seeds of doubt. Will the government be able to protect us? Will the costs of independence outweigh the benefits? Should we compromise to avoid more bloodshed? These are the questions that the old order hopes will spread among the population, eroding the unity and resolve that are essential for true sovereignty. However, in targeting Dargo, the old order also risks exposing its own hand. The pattern of destabilization has become so predictable that each new attack invites deeper investigation into who might be pulling the strings. Analysts, journalists, and activists across Africa are increasingly connecting these events to broader geopolitical strategies. While the old order prefers to operate in the shadows, the growing awareness among African citizens means that such tactics can also backfire, strengthening resistance rather than breaking it. The fight over Dargo is thus more than a battle for territory. It is a battle for the future of African self-determination. every bullet fired and every home destroyed is part of a struggle over whether African nations can chart their own course without interference. For the old order, victory means maintaining control over Africa's political and economic systems, ensuring that sovereignty remains a paper promise rather than a lived reality. For the defenders of Dargo and the government they support, standing firm in the face of such attacks is a declaration that Africa will no longer accept chains, whether they come in the form of colonial armies or modern agreements signed under pressure. The conflict is both a territorial battle and an ideological war, intertwining the struggle for physical land with the fight over political vision, national identity, and the very definition of sovereignty. On the surface, the clashes in places like Dargo may appear to be about control over towns, routes, and resources. But beneath the dust and gunfire lies a deeper confrontation between two opposing worldviews. One side seeks to maintain a system where African nations remain tethered to external powers for their security, economic policy, and political direction, while the other demands a break from these old patterns. It's insisting on self-reliance and independence in every sphere. The territorial dimension of this conflict is immediately visible. Control of strategic locations like Dargo matters for security, supply lines, and the protection of populations. Towns, roads, and resource-rich areas can shift the balance of power on the battlefield. Whoever controls them gains the ability to move troops, protect trade, and influence the flow of goods and information. In a country like Burkina Faso, where insurgent groups, criminal networks, and foreign-backed agents operate in remote regions, holding territory becomes a lifeline for the central government's legitimacy. Losing such ground would be more than a military setback. It would symbolize weakness and invite further challenges from enemies who see an opportunity to press harder. Yet the ideological dimension of this war makes it far more complex than a conventional territorial dispute. This is not simply a matter of two rival factions fighting for land. It is a struggle between a vision of a sovereign Africa free from foreign dominance and an entrenched global order that has long benefited from keeping the continent dependent. Every skirmish, every defensive stand, and every village that refuses to yield to outside influence is part of a broader narrative about what kind of nation Burkina Faso will be, and, by extension, what kind of future Africa can claim for itself. The ideological stakes are high because they touch on questions of who gets to decide the destiny of the nation. Will Burkina Faso's policies be dictated in foreign capitals or shaped by the will of its own people? Will its resources continue to be extracted for the benefit of external corporations, or will they be harnessed to improve the lives of its citizens? These questions form the backbone of the ideological war, and every battle in the field is also a battle over these principles. Dual nature of the conflict means that military tactics alone cannot resolve it. Even if one side gains control of the land, the war for hearts and minds continues. In towns like Dargo, the population's loyalty can be as decisive as the positioning of troops. Residents who believe in the cause of sovereignty are less likely to collaborate with enemy forces, more willing to provide intelligence to defenders, and more determined to endure hardship in the name of a greater goal. Conversely, if ideological resolve weakens, territory can be lost without a fight as communities give in to pressure, fear, or promises of material gain from those aligned with the old order. For the forces defending Burkina Faso's sovereignty, this ideological component requires constant reinforcement. Propaganda, community outreach, and visible examples of government commitment to the people are as vital as weapons and ammunition. It is not enough to repel attacks. It is necessary to remind the population why the struggle is worth enduring. In this sense, the ideological war is fought in speeches, in the distribution of aid, in the fairness of local governance, and in the symbolic acts that demonstrate independence from foreign control. For the old order and its local proxies, the ideological battlefield is equally critical. We understand that undermining the people's faith in their government is as effective as capturing territory. Disinformation campaigns, economic sabotage, and selective targeting of civilian areas are intended to sow doubt, create fear, and erode the unity that sustains resistance. By framing the government as incapable or untrustworthy, They aim to weaken the ideological foundation upon which the fight for sovereignty rests. The intertwining of territory and ideology also means that every victory or defeat has amplified consequences. When defenders hold their ground, they are not just protecting homes. They are proving that the idea of a free and self-governing Burkina Faso can withstand assault. When attackers seize land, they are not just gaining a tactical advantage. They are making a statement that resistance is futile and that the old order's reach is still strong. This dynamic explains why battles for places like Dargo are so fiercely contested, and why neither side can afford to treat them as minor engagements. In practical terms, the territorial and ideological aspects of the war feed into each other. A strong ideological commitment can inspire communities to fortify their defenses, resist intimidation, and rally fighters even in the face of overwhelming odds. In turn, holding and protecting territory reinforces the ideological message that the cause is viable and that independence is achievable. Losing ground, however, can have the opposite effect, breeding disillusionment and weakening the morale needed to sustain the fight. The conflict's dual nature also complicates peace efforts. Negotiations that address only the territorial issues without resolving the ideological divide are unlikely to produce lasting stability. Even if borders are redrawn or ceasefires are signed, the underlying struggle over national direction and sovereignty will persist, ready to ignite new confrontations. This is why the war in Burkina Faso, and in Dargo specifically, cannot be seen in isolation from the larger Pan-African movement towards self-determination. It is part of a continental awakening where the control of land and the control of narrative are inseparable, and where each battle fought is both a defense of home soil and a stand against the global structures that seek to dictate Africa's future. If this story opened your eyes to the hidden battles shaping Africa's future, then don't just watch, be part of the movement. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the truth they don't want you to hear. Like this video to push the message further, and drop a comment with your thoughts because your voice matters in this fight for sovereignty. The more we speak, the harder it becomes for them to silence us.